The sultry Louisiana summer of 1853 hung over the Dubois plantation like a heavy, damp cloak, pressing down on the grand columns of the mansion and the sprawling fields beyond. Cicadas droned relentlessly, their high-pitched, unceasing song blending with the distant clatter of horses' hooves and the rhythmic calls of overseers across the sugarcane fields. Clara Dubois, a young woman of 19, sat in the parlor, fanning herself with delicate embroidered lace and staring out through the tall windows at the wide expanse of her family's estate. From the outside, the plantation looked like a picture of southern gentility and prosperity, whitewashed columns gleaming in the sun, perfectly manicured lawns leading down to a river that glittered like molten silver, and workers moving with practiced rhythm through the fields. But for Clara, the mansion's beauty could not mask the oppressive weight of expectation. Her father, Henri Dubois, was a man both respected and feared in St. John Parish, a figure whose stern gaze and sharp tongue left no room for defiance. Henri Dubois prided himself on tradition, reputation, and above all, the careful orchestration of his family's social image. To him, daughters were treasures whose primary purpose was to secure advantageous marriages and maintain the household's social prominence. Clara, with her sharp mind, quick temper, and independent streak, had never conformed to the mold he so rigidly enforced. While her sisters charmed with demure smiles and polite conversation, Clara preferred books to ballrooms, ideas to embroidery. She questioned customs, argued over trivialities like the price of sugar, and often retorted to her father with a boldness that left him both exasperated and wary. It was not that Henri disliked Clara. He valued intelligence, but he could not abide what he saw as social impropriety. In polite society she was, in his eyes, unmarriageable, and in a world where daughters were pawns in the silent game of social advancement, this was nothing short of a disaster. The whispers of neighbors had begun to reach even the furthest corners of the plantation. The women who once nodded politely at Clara now avoided her gaze. Even her mother's gentle admonishments failed to stifle the rumor that Clara was too headstrong, too bold, too independent to ever secure a suitable husband. That evening, Henri summoned Clara to his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and polished mahogany furniture, the scent of tobacco and ink mingling in the heavy air. Clara entered, her posture stiff, a mixture of defiance and apprehension bracing her for whatever reprimand awaited. "Clara," her father said, his voice low but sharp, like a whip cracked just beneath the surface of civility, "you are 18 years old. You should be preparing to secure your future, not reading those foolish volumes about science and philosophy, nor wandering among the quarters as if you belonged there." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I am learning, father," she said, trying to keep her tone measured. "There is more to life than marrying well. I want to understand the world, not just parade about it." Henri's eyes narrowed, the lines on his face deepening. "Parade? No, Clara. You parade your arrogance. A daughter's first duty is to her family's name. And yet here you are, showing no inclination to marry. It is intolerable." He paused, letting the word linger in the heavy air between them. "I cannot have a daughter who shames our family. You are unfit, Clara, unmarriageable." The words struck her like a physical blow. She felt her chest tighten, a mixture of indignation, hurt and anger swelling within her. Unmarriageable. The term echoed in her mind, resonating with every whispered insult she had endured. But instead of despair, it sparked a fierce, quiet determination in her. She would not be defined by her father's narrow vision, nor by the whispers of the town. Henri's gaze softened, not for Clara's sake, but because he believed he had a solution that would correct her wayward nature. "I have decided," he said, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, "that you will be sent to the quarters to live under the supervision of Elias." Clara's brow furrowed. "Elias?" she asked, the name unfamiliar, yet carrying a weight she could not yet understand. "The largest slave on the plantation," Henri continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "He is disciplined, principled, and formidable. You will live among the workers, learn obedience, and perhaps, through his guidance, gain the humility and perspective you so sorely lack." Clara's mind raced. The idea of being sent to live among the enslaved workers of the plantation was unthinkable. She had visited the quarters only briefly, and even those moments had left her uneasy. The cabins were simple and harsh, a stark contrast to the polished floors and scented curtains of her home. The people there were treated as property, their labor demanded, their freedoms stripped away. And now she, the daughter of the plantation's master, was to join them, not as a visitor, but as a resident. "Father," she said, struggling to control her rising panic, "surely there is another way. I am not a child to be disciplined in this manner. Must I be sent to him, to live among people who—" She faltered, unable to finish the thought without acknowledging the prejudices that still clung to her upbringing. Henri's eyes hardened. "You misunderstand me, Clara. This is not a punishment, it is a lesson. You have no suitors, no prospects. If you refuse to learn humility and respect for labor, your family name will suffer. Perhaps then, living among those who truly toil will show you the value of hard work and the strength of character you claim to admire so much." Clara felt a chill run through her, not from the summer heat, but from the realization that her life was about to change irrevocably. She had always believed herself to be in control of her own destiny, yet now her father wielded the power of her future like a blade, cutting away her comfort and security. For the first time she truly understood the limitations imposed by her birth and social class. Over the next few days, the preparations began. Her belongings were packed, not in the elegant trunks she was accustomed to, but in simple baskets that she would carry herself. Her dresses were replaced with plain, coarse garments, more suitable for labor than leisure. Clara watched as her hair was tied back in a practical braid, the elaborate curls of her usual style replaced with functionality. Each step, each adjustment, felt like a stripping away of the world she had known. The day of her departure arrived, thick with heat and the oppressive scent of sugarcane. The workers paused in their tasks to watch, curiosity flickering in their eyes as the master's daughter prepared to leave the mansion. Elias, the man her father had singled out, appeared at the edge of the fields. He was taller and broader than any man she had ever seen, his posture straight, his gaze calm but unyielding. Clara noted the respect, even fear, with which he was regarded by both enslaved and free alike. He spoke little, his presence alone commanding attention. Henri's final instructions were terse. "You will obey him. You will learn from him. Fail and you will disgrace this family forever." He paused, his gaze lingering on her with a mixture of authority and faint concern, a recognition, perhaps, of the severity of the task he had set. "Go now." Clara stepped forward, heart pounding, and crossed the threshold of the mansion, leaving behind polished floors, scented curtains, and the world she had known. As she approached Elias, the sun glinting off the tall sugarcane stalks, she felt a swirl of fear, curiosity, and defiance. She did not know what awaited her, but one truth was clear. Her life had changed forever as she entered the quarters under Elias's watchful eye. Clara realized that she was stepping into a world governed by different rules, a place where her intellect and social standing carried little weight, and where survival depended on understanding strength, patience, and resilience. For the first time, she sensed that perhaps her father's harsh judgment of unmarriageable was not entirely a condemnation, but an unwelcome invitation to discover a new kind of power, one that could not be measured by suitors or social rank. And so, in the oppressive Louisiana heat, surrounded by the sounds of labor and whispered conversations of those who lived on the edge of freedom, Clara Dubois began her journey, a journey that would challenge everything she had known, strip her of pretension, and force her to confront the world in ways she had never imagined. It was the beginning of a transformation, one that would shape her mind, her heart, and her destiny. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the vast Louisiana fields, casting long, wavering shadows across the sugarcane that stretched like an ocean toward the horizon. Clara Dubois, still trembling from the weight of her father's declaration and the journey from the mansion, found herself standing at the threshold of the slave quarters for the first time as a resident. The transition from her father's refined home to this austere world was jarring. Here, there were no polished floors, no embroidered curtains, No air perfumed with flowers. The smell of smoke, cooking fires, and wet earth filled her nose, mingling with the tang of sweat from men and women laboring under the oppressive heat. Clara's eyes roamed the small cluster of wooden cabins, each with a low sagging roof, smoke curling from the chimneys. Between them, the paths were dirt, worn smooth by years of footsteps, children playing, and animals scurrying. Laundry hung on lines between the cabins, swaying gently in the humid breeze. The people moving about the space glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with a guarded wariness. None approached. She was not one of them, and yet she was no longer entirely separate from this world. Elias waited near the edge of the field, his figure imposing even at a distance. His skin, dark and glistening with the sweat of labor, gleamed in the last rays of sunlight. Tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with a calm authority, he commanded attention without a word. Clara felt her chest tighten, not with fear, though fear was present, but with a strange mixture of awe and apprehension. This was the man her father had chosen to instruct her, a man whose reputation as the largest, strongest, and most disciplined of the enslaved workers on the plantation preceded him. As she stepped closer, Elias's eyes met hers. They were dark, steady, and penetrating, and Clara felt as if he could see past the layers of her social pretensions straight into her core. He said nothing, but nodded slightly, acknowledging her presence without a trace of sentimentality or mockery. Clara realized immediately that Elias would not coddle her, nor would he allow her to pretend she understood this world. The quarters themselves were small but functional. The cabin Elias led her into was furnished sparsely, a few wooden beds, rough-hewn tables and stools, with shelves holding simple cookware, tools, and a handful of personal items. There were no decorations, no luxuries, no semblance of the refined world Clara had left behind. She noticed the careful organization, the beds neatly made, the tools arranged according to purpose, the space kept meticulously clean despite the dirt that clung stubbornly to the floors. Elias's attention to order was evident in every detail. Clara's first moments inside the cabin were filled with uncertainty. She instinctively reached for a chair to sit, but Elias shook his head subtly, gesturing for her to stand. The lesson was immediate. This world demanded observation first, comfort second. The air inside the cabin was thick, a mixed pure of sweat, smoke, and the earthy aroma of the dirt floors. Clara's refined sensibilities bristled, but she did not protest. The unspoken rule was clear. Resistance would accomplish nothing. "You will learn," Elias said finally, his voice calm but firm, "by doing. You will work and you will watch. Only then will you understand." His tone carried no malice, only authority. Clara felt a flicker of defiance rise within her, but it was tempered by the undeniable reality that he possessed the power to shape her experience entirely. She nodded, keeping her voice measured. "I understand." Her first tasks were simple, yet exhausting in ways she had never known. She was assigned to help carry water from the well, a task that required strength and balance. The buckets were heavy, the sun unrelenting, and Clara's arms ached almost immediately. She stumbled on the uneven ground, her polished manners and careful posture of the mansion, leaving her useless in the dirt paths and swaying grass. Elias watched silently, stepping in only when she was about to drop a bucket, correcting her grip with a gentle, precise touch that left her flustered. "You must learn to work with your body," he said simply. "Strength is not just in the arms, it is in focus, balance, and the mind guiding the work." Clara listened carefully, repeating his motions, feeling the unfamiliar ache in muscles she had neglected her entire life. She felt humiliated, but she also felt something stirring within her, a curiosity, an admiration, and, beneath it all, the faint beginnings of respect. As the days passed, Clara adjusted, though never without struggle. She learned to scrub floors until they shone, to tend the small garden that fed the quarters, and to assist in preparing simple meals over open fires. Each task was a revelation. She had never realized the skill, patience, and subtle knowledge required to manage even the smallest chores, nor had she considered the ingenuity necessary to survive in a world so stripped of convenience. And always, Elias was there, guiding without condescension, correcting without anger, expecting effort without complaint. The other enslaved workers regarded her presence with cautious scrutiny. Some whispered behind her back, others offered brief nods or guarded smiles. Clara sensed that they understood she was different, yet she was now part of their world whether she liked it or not. She could not return to the mansion with its privileges, nor could she immediately claim acceptance among the quarters. Each day was a delicate negotiation, learning the unspoken rules of behavior, the hierarchy of respect, and the quiet ways in which authority was wielded and observed. One afternoon, while she was helping tend to the small garden, a child from the quarters approached her, shy but curious. "You live here now?" the child asked, eyes wide. Clara nodded, surprised by the simplicity of the question and the lack of judgment in the child's tone. "Yes," she said softly, "I do." The child's small smile, hesitant and bright, gave Clara a strange comfort. In that moment she realized that acceptance might not come from wealth or birthright, but from presence, effort, and a willingness to learn. Evenings were the most challenging. After a day of labor, Clara's body ached in ways she had never known, her hands raw from scrubbing and lifting, her back stiff from bending and carrying. Yet the quiet of the quarters at night held a strange beauty. The air was cooler, filled with the soft sounds of crickets and distant frogs, with the occasional whisper of voices or laughter from neighboring cabins. Clara sat on a small wooden stool, observing Elias as he moved about, checking the cabins, adjusting tools, and attending to tasks with the meticulous care of someone who understood the value of order. It was during these quiet moments that Clara began to notice the depth of Elias's character. He was not merely strong, he was deliberate, patient, and unflinching in his commitment to the responsibilities he bore. He carried the weight of the plantation on his shoulders in a way that required courage, intelligence, and moral fortitude. Clara realized she had underestimated him, expecting harshness or cruelty, but discovering instead a kind of quiet dignity that left her both humbled and intrigued. The bond between them grew slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Clara learned to anticipate his instructions, to read his subtle gestures, and to respect his presence without fear. Elias in turn seemed to acknowledge her efforts, offering brief nods of approval or small corrections delivered with a calm authority. It was a relationship defined by mutual understanding, yet fraught with the delicate tension of social hierarchies, unspoken rules, and the ever-present scrutiny of those around them. As weeks turned into months, Clara's initial fear began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of capability. She discovered strength in her body, resilience in her mind, and a surprising sense of satisfaction in work well done. She began to recognize that the quarters were not merely a place of punishment or humility, but a world with its own order, logic, and lessons. Here, she was learning not just to survive, but to observe, to understand, and to respect the strength inherent in others. A strength that had nothing to do with wealth or social standing, yet, even as Clara adapted, the tension between her upbringing and her new life remained palpable. The polished manners, the refined speech, and the social education instilled by her family were of little use here. Instead, she had to navigate new expectations, the rhythm of labor, the hierarchy among the quarters, and the subtle ways in which Elias commanded respect. It was a constant challenge, one that tested her patience, humility, and ingenuity. One evening, as Clara carried a water bucket back from the well, Elias spoke quietly, almost as if testing her understanding. "Do you see, Clara, why I am here, not to punish you, but to guide you?" His eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. She nodded, feeling the truth of his words resonate. "Yes," she said softly, "I think I am beginning to understand." Elias did not smile, but a faint softening in his gaze suggested acknowledgement. In that moment, Clara realized that this was not merely about labor, obedience, or humility. It was about knowledge of herself, of others, and of the world she had so long ignored. The quarters, with all their hardship and simplicity, were a crucible, and Elias, the steady force within it, was both teacher and test. The months continued. Clara's presence in the quarters became less an intrusion and more a fixture. She was still an outsider, and yet she was learning to move through this world with grace and awareness. The workers who had initially regarded her with suspicion began to nod politely, some even offering quiet words of guidance. The children, curious and unafraid, treated her with a tentative camaraderie that was slowly breaking the barrier between the world she had known and the one she now inhabited. Clara began to understand, in ways her father's mansion could never teach, the value of labor, patience, and quiet authority. She saw how respect was earned, not demanded, and how strength could manifest in many forms. And always, Elias was there, a constant presence, guiding her without indulgence, shaping her understanding not with words alone, but with example. By the end of her first year in the quarters, Clara had changed profoundly. Her body was stronger, her mind sharper, her perspective broader. She had learned the rhythm of life in a world that demanded more of her than her father ever had. And while the term unmarriageable still lingered in the back of her mind, it had begun to lose its sting. In its place was a new understanding that power, knowledge, and dignity were not granted by birth, but earned through effort, courage, and understanding. In the fading light of a Louisiana evening, Clara stood beside Elias, watching the sun sink behind the distant fields. She no longer saw herself as the helpless girl her father had scorned. She was becoming someone new, shaped by labor, observation, and the steady hand of a man who had challenged every assumption she had ever held. The world of the quarters, harsh and unforgiving though it was, had begun to teach her what wealth and privilege never could: the strength of character, the depth of resilience, and the quiet power of understanding one's place in the world. And so, Clara Dubois, the daughter once labeled unmarriageable, began to walk a path entirely her own, guided by Elias and the unforgiving, illuminating realities of life in the plantation quarters. She was no longer merely surviving, she was learning, growing, and discovering the strength within herself, a strength that would shape her future in ways her father could never have imagined. The days that followed Clara's arrival in the quarters unfolded with a rhythm she had never experienced. Mornings began before the sun had fully risen, the sky streaked with pale lavender and gold, and the air already thick with the damp heat of Louisiana summer. The sound of distant birds mingled with the low, steady hum of human activity as the enslaved workers prepared for the day's labor. Clara, once accustomed to leisurely breakfasts in the mansion with fine linens and delicate china, now carried a bucket of water to begin chores before dawn, her hands stiff and unaccustomed to the weight. Elias moved beside her, silent yet observant, his broad shoulders a constant reminder of the strength and discipline she had yet to attain. Every motion he made was purposeful, every step measured. When she faltered in her balance or grip, he adjusted her silently, his fingers firm but careful. Strength, he said once, is not in brute force alone. It is in knowing how to wield it, in understanding the work, and in aligning mind and body. Clara nodded, struggling to absorb the lesson while her arms trembled with fatigue. The initial humiliation of her ineptitude gnawed at her pride. She had never known a task that left her physically exhausted and mentally unsettled in equal measure. Each morning brought new labor, fetching water, tending the garden, preparing simple meals, and cleaning the small cabin that had become her temporary home. At first, the work seemed endless, a constant barrage of tasks that exposed her ignorance of the simplest practicalities. She spilled water, broke tools, and stumbled over uneven ground, her finely trained hands ill-suited to the demands of physical labor. Yet slowly, with Elias's patient guidance, she began to notice small improvements. Her grip strengthened, her arms gained muscle, and her steps became surer. The water no longer sloshed over the edges of the bucket, the soil of the garden yielded more readily to her hands, and her movements acquired a rhythm she had never known in the manicured halls of her father's mansion. Each day brought subtle victories, each small success a quiet affirmation that she could learn, adapt, and endure. Elias's methods were exacting. He expected attention to detail, precision, and effort, refusing to indulge mistakes born of ignorance or pride. Yet he never berated her, never mocked her failures. Instead, he demonstrated the proper technique, observing her as she repeated it until her motions mirrored his. In this, Clara began to understand the difference between punishment and instruction, between authority and respect. Elias's power was not enforced by fear alone, it was earned through knowledge, skill, and unwavering principle. The other workers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Clara could feel their gazes upon her as she struggled to lift heavy buckets, scrub floors, or kneel in the dirt for planting. Some whispered behind her back, questioning her place in this world, while others offered quiet words of encouragement. testing whether she had the perseverance to endure. Children, unburdened by prejudice, approached her openly, asking questions and offering small gestures of friendship that warmed her amidst the rigors of labor. One afternoon, as Clara labored in the garden, she felt the weight of exhaustion settle over her like a thick cloak. Her hands were blistered from the rough soil, her back ached from bending over for hours, and sweat poured from her brow, stinging her eyes. She paused to catch her breath, leaning on her hoe, and found Elias watching from the edge of the field. His gaze was steady, unjudging yet penetrating, as if he could see the limits of her patience, the tremor of her pride, and the quiet determination she tried to conceal.
"You are stronger than you realize," he said finally, his voice calm and deliberate. "Your body adapts because it must, but your mind is still learning.
Remember that every task is not just work, it is a lesson in patience, precision, and endurance. If you can master these, the rest will follow." Clara nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. They were simple yet profound, a reminder that the true challenge lay not in her physical discomfort, but in cultivating the discipline to persist despite it were the hardest. After the day's labor, Clara's body ached in ways she had never imagined. Her hands were raw, her muscles stiff and unrelenting in their soreness. At the mansion, she had never known such exhaustion. Tiredness had always been a fleeting discomfort, easily remedied by a comfortable chair or a soft bed. Here, she slept on a simple wooden cot, the mattress thin and unyielding, and the night air heavy with humidity. The sounds of the quarters, soft murmurs of conversation, the distant cry of children, and the occasional bark of a dog, lulled her to a restless sleep, each moment a reminder of the harsh reality she now inhabited. Yet in the midst of struggle, Clara began to notice the subtle beauty of life in the quarters. She saw resilience etched into every face, quiet dignity in the smallest acts of labor, and an unspoken solidarity among those who shared her world. She learned that strength was not only in muscles but in endurance, in the ability to bear hardship without losing one's humanity. She began to understand that the quarters were more than a place of punishment or training. They were a community, a microcosm of survival, and a repository of knowledge far richer than any book she had studied in her father's mansion. Elias became both guide and mirror in this world. Clara observed his interactions with others, the careful way he distributed tasks, the subtle gestures that commanded respect without intimidation, the quiet words of advice or correction offered to those who faltered. She realized that his authority was not arbitrary. It was earned, cultivated through years of experience, observation, and unwavering principle. And as she absorbed these lessons, she began to see herself differently. She was no longer merely a pampered daughter thrust into labor. She was a student of resilience, discipline, and the complexities of human behavior. Her pride, once sharp and defensive, began to soften under the weight of her experiences. She learned that humility was not weakness, nor was obedience merely submission. Instead, they were tools, skills to be honed, like any other, requiring awareness, adaptability, and patience. Each task she completed, each correction she absorbed, was a step toward mastery not only of labor but of herself. She began to understand that the term unmarriageable, so harshly pronounced by her father, was not a condemnation of her value, but a challenge to discover strength beyond social expectation. Interactions with Elias were the most instructive. He allowed her to make mistakes, yet he never permitted complacency. One morning, she failed to balance a heavy bucket while fetching W.A., spilling its contents across the dirt path. Elias stepped forward silently, adjusted her stance, and guided her through the motion again. "You must feel the weight, not just bear it," he said. "The body learns through precision and attention, not mere effort." Clara followed his instructions carefully, repeating the process until her movements were steady. The lesson was clear. Understanding came not from resistance or argument, but from observation, repetition, and mindful practice. Gradually, Clara noticed subtle shifts in the quarters as well. The workers who had once watched her with skepticism began to accept her presence, some offering small gestures of assistance or quiet words of encouragement. Children ran to greet her, sharing laughter and curiosity, and even the adults began to nod in recognition of her growing competence. Clara realized that belonging, however tentative, was earned through effort, respect, and the willingness to learn from those around her. Winter approached, bringing slightly cooler temperatures and a break from the relentless Louisiana heat. The rhythm of life in the quarters became familiar, a cadence of labor, observation, and learning that carried Clara through each day. She had developed calloused hands, stronger muscles, and a more resilient body, but the transformation in her mind and spirit was equally profound. She had learned patience, humility, and the value of perseverance. She had begun to understand the subtle dynamics of authority, respect, and human relationships in ways her refined upbringing could never have taught. Through all this, Elias remained a steady presence, neither indulgent nor harsh, guiding her with a balance of discipline and quiet encouragement. Clara began to notice the depth of his wisdom, the way he observed without interference, corrected without humiliation, and led through example rather than coercion. She began to admire him, not merely for his physical strength, but for the principles he embodied and the integrity with which he navigated a world that sought to constrain him. One evening, as they completed the final chores for the day, Clara paused to watch the sun sink behind the sugarcane fields. Elias stood nearby, overseeing the cabins with his usual calm vigilance. Clara felt a swell of gratitude, respect, and a strange, unnameable connection to the man who had guided her through this unfamiliar world. She realized that the lessons she had learned extended far beyond labor. They were lessons in endurance, self-respect, and the quiet power of observation and understanding. Clara's transformation was not complete, nor would it be for some time. There were still challenges, failures, and moments of doubt. Yet the first seeds of change had taken root. She had begun to see herself not as the pampered, fragile daughter her father had scorned, but as a young woman capable of learning, adapting, and persevering. She had begun to understand that strength was not measured by wealth, birth, or social standing, but by resilience, discipline, and the courage to face hardship without losing one's humanity. And so, in the quiet of the quarters, amidst the sweat, dirt, and labor, Clara Dubois continued her journey. The girl once labeled unmarriageable was learning to redefine herself, guided by Elias's steady hand and the relentless demands of a world that offered no easy comforts. Each day brought new challenges, new lessons, and a growing understanding that true strength was forged not in the salons and drawing rooms of her father's mansion, but in the patient, unyielding rhythm of labor, observation, and self-discovery. At the end of her first year fully immersed in the quarters, Clara had begun to embody the lessons Elias imparted. She moved with purpose, observed with care, and acted with intention. The work no longer humbled her in the way it once had. Instead, it sharpened her mind, strengthened her body, and clarified her understanding of human resilience. She had learned humility, not as submission but as awareness, a recognition of limits, responsibilities, and the unspoken rules that governed life in this harsh, unforgiving environment. Clara now understood more fully than she ever had before that the world her father had confined her to, the world of wealth, status, and social appearances, was but a narrow frame. The quarters, with all their hardship, complexity, and quiet dignity, had taught her lessons that could not be found in books or ballrooms. And in Elias, she had found not merely a teacher, but a model of strength, patience, and the unwavering principle that guided every action he took. The girl who had arrived trembling, unsure, and humiliated was gone, replaced by someone who could observe, endure, and reflect. She was still learning, still growing, but the foundation had been laid, a foundation of humility, resilience, and an understanding of strength that transcended the fragile expectations of Southern society. In the quarters, under Elias's watchful eye, Clara Dubois was beginning to discover what it truly meant to survive, to respect, and ultimately to be free in spirit, even within the confines of a world that sought to constrain her. Winter had loosened its grip over the Louisiana plantation, leaving the air cooler, softer, and filled with the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Clara Dubois had now spent months in the quarters, her hands calloused, her back strong, and her mind attuned to the rhythm of labor. The once insurmountable tasks that had humiliated her, the hauling of water, tending of gardens, and scrubbing of the cabin, had become exercises in endurance and focus. Yet, even as she grew more capable, there remained a subtle, unspoken distance between herself and the people who lived there, and especially between her and Elias. Respect had been established, yes, but connection, true human connection, was a bridge that had yet to be crossed. Clara had begun to notice small things about Elias in the way one notices a complex painting from across a gallery. The precision of his movements, the slight bend of his fingers as he adjusted a tool, the way his eyes followed a task from start to finish with quiet calculation. Each gesture spoke of intelligence, experience, and a steady, unshakable patience. He rarely spoke unless necessary, and yet when he did, his words carried weight far beyond the simplicity of their form. One grey morning, as Clara carried a basket of freshly harvested vegetables from the garden to the kitchen area, Elias approached her from the path. He had been observing the workers as he always did, and now his gaze rested on her. There was no judgment in it, only measured attention. "You are improving," he said simply. His voice, calm and unhurried, carried a sense of authority she could not defy, yet it was neither harsh nor intimidating. Clara paused, surprised. "Thank you," she said, unsure of how to respond. Praise was unfamiliar, and she felt an odd flush of embarrassment at receiving it. I am learning." "You are," Elias replied, "but you must observe more than you act. Understanding comes before mastery. Watch, then do. Every task has its lesson, if you are willing to see it." It was the first time he had addressed her with such a tone that implied recognition, not just correction. Clara felt a stir of curiosity and something softer, something like trust. She realized in that quiet moment that Elias was beginning to treat her not merely as a pupil, but as a companion capable of comprehension. That afternoon, while assisting in the preparation of meals over the open fires, Clara found herself lingering after her tasks were complete. She had noticed Elias supervising a group of younger men, teaching them to repair tools and maintain the fences with efficiency and care. His instructions were simple, direct, yet each contained nuance, subtle lessons about patience, foresight, and the balance between force and delicacy. Clara felt compelled to ask a question, though she hesitated, conscious of the boundaries she had been taught to respect. "Elias," she began cautiously, "how do you know which task to prioritize when everything seems urgent?" He looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing whether she was ready for an answer. Then, with a slight nod, he spoke. "You observe, you assess the consequences of delay, the risk of error, and the resources you have. Then you act. Urgency is not always what it seems. Wisdom is knowing what matters most in the moment." Clara considered his words carefully. They were simple in phrasing, but the weight of experience behind them was palpable. She realized she had been rushing, trying to complete every task at once, without understanding the subtleties of timing and priority that governed life in the quarters. Elias was teaching her more than physical labor. He was teaching her judgment, awareness, and the importance of measured action. Over the weeks that followed, their exchanges became more frequent, though always measured. Clara asked questions about planting techniques, tool maintenance, and the proper care of animals. Elias answered patiently, sometimes demonstrating with a careful motion, sometimes guiding her hands through the task until she could replicate it. Each interaction was a delicate balance between instruction and observation, with both of them testing the limits of understanding and trust. As winter softened into spring, the quarters themselves began to take on a more familiar rhythm. Clara recognized the sounds of the children playing, the cadence of conversations among workers, and the unspoken patterns of daily life. She had learned to move through the space without disturbing its harmony, to anticipate needs, and to participate in small ways that built subtle bridges of trust. The workers, who had initially regarded her with suspicion, now acknowledged her presence with nods and occasional smiles. She was still an outsider, but no longer an intruder. One afternoon, Elias asked her to accompany him to inspect the far edge of the plantation, where the fields met the swampy boundary. The walk was long, the path uneven, and Clara's muscles protested, though she moved with the growing strength of months of labor. As they walked, Elias spoke of the land, how to recognize soil that would yield crops, how to protect young plants from disease, and how to anticipate the weather based on subtle changes in wind and sky. He spoke as if the land itself were alive, each plant, tree, and creek a teacher, if one knew how to observe. "You see," he said, pausing to gesture toward a patch of reeds, "understanding the land is understanding life. Both require patience, attention, and respect. You cannot force growth, only guide it. The same is true of people." Clara considered his words carefully. They resonated deeply, echoing the lessons she had already begun to learn through labor and observation. There was a symmetry to his teaching, physical labor and moral insight intertwined, each reinforcing the other. She realized that her respect for Elias was evolving, shifting from awe to admiration and something quieter, more intimate, a budding sense of friendship forged through shared understanding. The weeks turned into months, and Clara found herself observing Elias in ways she had never anticipated. She noticed the small gestures of care he extended to the younger workers, a hand lightly placed on a shoulder, a quietly spoken word of reassurance, a correction given with patience rather than irritation. She began to understand that his authority was not based on fear alone, but on consistency, fairness, and an unwavering principle that guided all he did. Clara began to mirror these lessons in her own behavior, offering assistance to children, tending to the garden with meticulous care, and observing the subtleties of social interaction within the quarters. One evening, after E-Day's labor was complete, Clara and Elias sat on the edge of the field, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink, and the soft hum of insects filled the air. Clara felt a rare quiet settle over her, a calm that contrasted sharply with the anxious energy she had felt during her first days in the quarters. She realized that she had come to value these moments of observation, these intervals of reflection in which she could absorb lessons that were not found in books, but in life itself. "Elias," she said quietly, "I think I am beginning to understand what you mean about patience and observation. It is not just about work, is it? It is about seeing, learning, and knowing when to act." He turned to her, his expression calm, almost unreadable. "Yes," he said, "you are learning more than skill. You are learning judgment, awareness, and restraint. These are qualities that will serve you long after the work is done." Their conversation lingered, unspoken but understood, a bridge forming between them. Clara realized that their relationship was evolving into something more nuanced than teacher and pupil. There was mutual respect, yes, but also a quiet companionship built on shared understanding, labor, and observation. In Elias she had found not only instruction but guidance in how to navigate the world she had been thrust into. As spring turned to summer, Clara's confidence grew. She moved through the quarters with a sense of purpose, her labor executed with care and precision, her observations sharp and thoughtful. The workers, too, seemed to sense the change, offering small acknowledgments of her growing competence. Yet she remained conscious of the delicate balance she maintained. She was neither fully one of them nor fully apart, and every step required awareness, respect, and humility. Elias continued to challenge her, asking questions designed to test her judgment, guiding her hands through complex tasks, and observing her decisions with quiet scrutiny. Each lesson, each interaction, strengthened the bond between them. Clara found herself anticipating his instructions, reflecting on his words long after the tasks were complete, and internalizing the principles he imparted. The distance that had existed between them at her arrival had begun to shrink, replaced by a tentative trust, respect, and the first stirrings of a friendship that neither could yet define aloud. The quarters themselves had become a classroom of life, each task, each interaction, each observation a lesson in discipline, resilience, and empathy. Clara had come to understand the delicate hierarchy of respect, the unspoken rules that governed behavior, and the subtle ways in which authority and guidance could coexist without coercion. Elias had become both mentor and mirror, reflecting back her progress, her missteps, and her potential. By the time the first hints of midsummer appeared, Clara could feel the transformation within herself. She was no longer the fragile, uncertain girl who had arrived, fearful of humiliation and unsure of her place. She was learning to move with intention, to observe with care, and to act with understanding. Her respect for Elias had grown into a quiet admiration, and with it the beginnings of friendship, something unspoken, delicate, and rooted in shared experience rather than social expectation. In the long afternoons, as she rested beside him after completing the day's work, Clara allowed herself to notice the subtle rhythms of his character, the way he measured his words, the small gestures of kindness to those under his care, the patience with which he corrected mistakes. She realized that these were not merely acts of authority but expressions of a deep understanding of human nature. In this realization, she found both comfort and challenge, comfort in knowing she had a guide she could trust, and challenge in recognizing the standards she would have to meet to maintain his respect. And so the days passed, blending labor, observation, and instruction into a seamless rhythm. Clara Dubois, once dismissed as unmarriageable, began to discover a new kind of education, one forged not in the salons of her father's mansion, but in the quarters, among sweat, dirt, and the steady, watchful presence of Elias. Their bond remained unspoken but undeniable, a fragile friendship rooted in respect, shared labor, and the quiet understanding that both were learning from the other in ways neither could have anticipated. In these early months of friendship, Clara learned what humility truly meant, not subjugation, but awareness, not weakness, but patience, not silence, but understanding. And as she watched Elias move through the quarters with quiet authority and unflinching principle, she understood that this world, harsh though it was, offered lessons her previous life could never provide. Here, in toil, observation, and shared understanding, Clara found the first seeds of a connection that would shape her heart, her mind, and her future in ways her father could never have foreseen. By the time midsummer had fully settled over the Dubois plantation, the air was thick and heavy with heat, carrying the familiar scent of damp earth and sugarcane, mingled with the ever-present smoke from the cooking fires. The rhythm of the quarters had become familiar to Clara, her movements no longer tentative, her hands steady and calloused, her body accustomed to long hours of labor. Yet despite her growing competence, she had begun to realize that life in the quarters was not merely a series of tasks to master, it was a web of delicate relationships, unspoken rules, and ever-present dangers that required attention, foresight, and subtlety. Clara's growing friendship with Elias had given her insight into the workings of this world, but it had also shown her the precariousness of her position. Respect, she learned, was hard-won and easily lost. Small missteps could create suspicion. Even a glance or a whispered word could carry consequences. She had seen how other workers navigated tension among themselves, how rivalries simmered beneath the surface, and how the overseer's watchful eyes could turn everyday mistakes into opportunities for punishment. Each day was a delicate negotiation, and Clara had to be alert, aware, and careful in every interaction. It was on a particularly sweltering afternoon that the danger of her new life first became starkly clear. Clara was assisting in the maintenance of the far-field fences, a task that required constant vigilance. The tall sugarcane rustled around her, obscuring vision and amplifying the slightest sound. As she hammered a post into place, she felt a sudden sharp gaze upon her from the edge of the field. Turning, she saw two men from the quarters, faces shadowed and tense, whispering as they approached. They were known among the workers for their jealousy of Elias's authority, men who resented his influence and the respect he commanded from both enslaved and free alike. "You shouldn't be here," one of them muttered, his tone low and threatening. Clara's heart raced, her pulse hammering in her temples. She had never encountered open hostility in the quarters, only the subtle undercurrents of suspicion and judgment. This was something different, direct, confrontational, and dangerous. Before she could respond, Elias appeared at her side, moving with the quiet authority that had come to define him. His presence was immediate, protective, and commanding. The two men hesitated, exchanging a brief glance, and then one muttered a barely audible curse before retreating into the tall cane. Clara exhaled, the tension leaving her body in a rush, though her hands trembled as she returned to her task. "Do not let their presence distract you," Elias said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "They test not just your skill but your composure. You must learn to maintain both." Clara nodded, her being the lesson as her pulse slowly returned to normal. The encounter had been brief, yet its impact lingered, a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in the quarters, even for someone who had learned to navigate its rhythm. Over the following days, Clara began to pay closer attention to the subtle politics of the quarters. She observed rivalries, alliances, and the unspoken hierarchies that govern behavior. She learned to read expressions, gestures, and tones, recognizing when tension was brewing and when caution was required. It was a skill that demanded patience, awareness, and humility, the very lessons Elias had been teaching her from the beginning. One morning, Elias took her aside to inspect a section of the garden that had been damaged during a sudden storm. As they knelt in the soft soil, he spoke in a low voice, his gaze fixed on the young plants. "There is more to survival than strength," he said. "There is foresight, knowledge, and understanding. You have learned the labor, but now you must learn to anticipate, to plan, to protect. Life in the quarters is not just physical. It is strategy, observation, and discernment." Clara listened intently, her mind absorbing the complexity of his lesson. She realized that the dangers of the quarters were not limited to labor or physical exertion. They included social dynamics, potential violence, and the constant presence of authority that could be both protective and punitive. Every decision, every action, carried consequences, and the ability to navigate this world required a combination of intellect, awareness, and courage. As weeks passed, Clara faced other tests of resilience. One afternoon, a worker injured himself while tending the livestock, and Clara, with Elias's guidance, had to administer first aid. Her hands, skilled in labor but unpracticed in care, trembled as she followed his instructions. The injured man groaned, the pain evident in his eyes, and Clara's heart ached with a mixture of fear and empathy. Elias's steady presence was her anchor, his calm instructions allowing her to act with precision and confidence. By the time the man was stabilized, Clara felt a surge of accomplishment mingled with exhaustion, a reminder that competence in the quarters required not only strength but composure and empathy. Danger came not only from individuals but from the environment itself. Heavy rains would flood fields, storms could topple trees, and the oppressive heat could render even the most experienced workers vulnerable to exhaustion and illness. Clara learned to anticipate these threats, to adjust her actions accordingly, and to rely on Elias's knowledge and experience. She began to see the landscape itself as both teacher and adversary, each weathered tree, each winding path, each patch of soil carrying lessons in observation, foresight, and adaptability. Despite the dangers, Clara's connection with Elias deepened. She began to see him not only as a mentor, but as a model of resilience, judgment, and quiet authority. They shared small moments of conversation during labor, discussing planting techniques, tool maintenance, and the nuances of life in the quarters. These exchanges, though brief, were rich with insight, providing Clara with both practical knowledge and a sense of companionship. She felt a growing trust, a reliance on his guidance, and an admiration that extended beyond his physical strength to the depth of his understanding and character. The social dynamics of the quarters also presented challenges. Clara had to navigate her relationships with other workers carefully, earning respect through competence and observation, while avoiding missteps that could lead to ridicule or suspicion. She learned to balance humility with confidence, to assert herself when necessary, but to defer when appropriate. It was a delicate dance, requiring constant awareness, emotional intelligence, and the ability to read subtle cues. One evening, as they rested after a low day of labor, Elias spoke quietly of the importance of vigilance. "There are those who would see strength as a threat," he said. "Not all danger is immediate. Some is subtle, hidden in words, gestures, or unspoken resentment. You must learn to recognize it, to act with caution, and to maintain your composure." Clara absorbed his words, understanding that the lessons of the quarters extended far beyond physical labor. The true challenge lay in navigating a world where respect, authority, and survival were intertwined in complex and often invisible ways. A particularly tense moment arrived when a rumor of insubordination began to circulate among the workers. A young man, envious of Elias's authority and wary of Clara's presence, whispered of discontent to others, attempting to stir doubt and challenge the established order. Clara sensed the tension immediately, observing glances, hushed conversations, and subtle changes in demeanor. Elias noticed as well, his expression calm but vigilant, and he guided Clara in responding with discretion, patience, and careful observation. Together, they navigated the situation, diffusing potential conflict through strategy, understanding, and the quiet exercise of authority. Clara began to recognize that danger in the quarters was not always overt or immediate. It could be hidden in resentment, jealousy, or misunderstanding. Success required not only physical skill but emotional intelligence, observation, and foresight. She learned to anticipate, to read subtle cues, and to act with both courage and discretion. Each challenge, each moment of tension, reinforced the lessons Elias had been teaching from the beginning, that strength was not only in the body but in the mind, the heart, and the capacity to endure, adapt, and act wisely. Through these trials, Clara's confidence grew. She began to move through the quarters with a sense of awareness and purpose, her actions measured, her observations keen. The workers, once skeptical of her presence, began to acknowledge her competence, offering small nods of respect and occasional guidance. Clara realized that trust, once earned, could bridge the gap between her and the world she had once feared. Elias remained her constant guide, both protector and mentor. He demonstrated the subtle balance of authority and empathy, showing Clara how to navigate conflict, observe social dynamics, and respond to danger with composure. Their partnership deepened, rooted in shared experience, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that both were learning from each other. Clara began to see Elias not only as a teacher but as a confidant, someone whose insight, wisdom, and guidance were invaluable in a world that was at once beautiful, harsh, and unpredictable. One afternoon, as they inspected the far edge of the plantation, Clara felt the full weight of her progress. She moved confidently through the uneven terrain, her hands skilled in labor, her eyes alert to potential hazards, and her mind engaged in observation and analysis. She noticed subtle changes in the soil, the movement of the wind, and the behavior of the workers around her. She understood the lessons of foresight, patience, and vigilance that Elias had imparted, and she felt a growing sense of competence and assurance. In these moments, Clara began to recognize a profound truth, that survival, respect, and resilience in the quarters required more than obedience or labor. They required understanding, strategy, and the quiet cultivation of trust and authority. The dangers she faced were real, but they were not insurmountable. With observation, skill, and guidance, she could navigate this complex world and assert herself without jeopardizing her safety or the fragile balance of respect she had established. By the end of the summer, Clara had transformed in ways her father could never have anticipated. She was no longer merely a pampered daughter or the girl deemed unmarriageable. She had grown, strong, capable, and perceptive, able to face both physical and social challenges with resilience and intelligence. The dangers of the quarters, once terrifying, had become opportunities for learning and growth, and her relationship with Elias had evolved into a partnership rooted in mutual respect, trust, and the shared experience of navigating a world that demanded strength in every form. Clara Dubois, once confined by the expectations of her family and society, had begun to understand the true nature of power, resilience, and human connection. She had learned that danger, when met with observation, patience, and careful action, could be managed. She had learned that respect, once earned, could bridge divides and create alliances, and she had learned that friendship and guidance could flourish even in the most challenging of circumstances. In the sultry Louisiana summer, amidst sweat, dirt, and the ever-present tension of life in the quarters, Clara had begun to discover not only her strength, but her capacity for judgment, awareness, and quiet courage. The lessons of labor, observation, and vigilance had shaped her into someone capable of navigating a world that was at once beautiful, dangerous, and deeply complex. And through it all, Elias remained her guide, mentor, and steadfast companion, shaping her understanding of life in ways that would endure far beyond the confines of the quarters. As the late summer sun scorched the Louisiana fields, Clara Dubois had transformed almost beyond recognition from the fragile, uncertain girl who had arrived months before. The labor of the quarters had molded her body into one of strength and endurance, her hands calloused but capable, her arms and back lean with muscle from the long hours of hauling, planting and tending the soil. Yet it was not merely her body that had changed. Her mind had sharpened, her judgment refined, and her understanding of human nature and survival deepened in ways her father's refined halls could never have taught. She had begun to move through the quarters with a sense of purpose, her actions deliberate, her observation keen, and her interactions marked by a careful balance of humility and confidence. Every task, every interaction, every decision was now approached with awareness, a reflection of the lessons Elias had instilled in her. He remained her constant guide, teaching her not just the mechanics of labor, but the principles of patience, judgment, and foresight. Clara had learned to anticipate challenges before they arose, to read the subtle shifts in body language and tone among the workers, and to act with precision and composure in situations that might have once terrified her. It was during one of these long afternoons, while repairing the fence that bordered the far edge of the plantation, that Clara first felt a surge of independence, so strong it startled her. The sun beat down relentlessly, and sweat stung her eyes, but she worked steadily, hammering posts with a rhythm that reflected her growing confidence. Elias observed silently from the edge of the field, his dark eyes sharp and attentive, yet he did not intervene. Clara realized, with a mixture of pride and apprehension, that he trusted her judgment, that he believed she was ready to act without constant guidance. The subtle acknowledgement of her autonomy was exhilarating, and Clara felt a rush of courage she had never known. For the first time, she began to consider her own desires, her own agency, and the possibility that she could navigate the world on her own terms, not merely as a passive participant in the designs of others. She had been shaped by the quarters, by Elias's guidance, and by the harsh realities of labor and danger, but now she sensed a quiet power within herself, a combination of resilience, knowledge, and intuition that could no longer be ignored. As she worked, her mind drifted to her father, to the haughty mansion she had left behind, and to the scornful words. He had spoken when he deemed her unmarriageable. Those words had haunted her at first, cutting deep into her pride, but now they felt hollow against the reality of her experiences. She had faced real danger, navigated complex social dynamics, and endured physical challenges that would have broken many. And yet, she had persevered. She had learned to respect herself, to understand others, and to wield the knowledge and skill she had acquired with care and discernment. The moment of confrontation with her father came unexpectedly one evening. He had ridden out from the mansion, his expensive horse throwing up dust as it carried him down the dirt path toward the quarters. Clara had been tending the garden with Elias nearby, her hands covered in soil, her clothes damp with sweat and dust. She had heard the horse before she saw it, and a flicker of apprehension passed through her. Her father, a man of rigid expectations and social pride, had never understood the world she had entered, and she knew this visit could carry the threat of condemnation or humiliation. "Clara!" His voice rang out across the quarters, sharp and demanding. She rose to meet him, her posture steady, her gaze clear. The workers paused in their tasks, glancing at the approaching man with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Elias remained near her side, silent but observant, his presence a quiet reassurance. "What is this?" her father demanded, dismounting and looking around at the quarters, the workers, and finally at her. "Why are you here, living among these people? This is no place for a lady. You are meant for society, for refinement, not—" Clara held up a hand, cutting off his tirade. The confidence she had cultivated through months of labor and observation now found voice in her tone. "Father," she said firmly, "I am learning things here you could never teach me. I am learning strength, patience, judgment, and understanding. I am learning to see the world as it truly is, not as you wish it to be." Her father's eyes narrowed, disbelief and irritation flashing across his face. "You dare speak to me in this tone? Do you not remember your place?" "I do remember," Clara replied, stepping closer, her voice unwavering. "But I have learned that my place is not determined by birth or society alone. Strength, resilience, and wisdom define a person, not the walls of a mansion or the approval of neighbors. I am not the fragile girl you believed I was. I am capable. I am learning. I am alive in a way I could never have been sheltered behind those walls." Her father's face flushed with anger, his pride wounded by her words, but Clara did not falter. She could see now that fear had no place in her response. Her body, trained through labor and endurance, was steady. Her mind, sharpened by observation and experience, was clear. And her heart, guided by respect and admiration for Elias and the lessons of the quarters, was courageous. Elias stepped forward then, his presence calm but commanding. "Sir," he said, his voice deep and measured, "your daughter is learning the ways of life, not merely the ways of society. She is developing judgment, strength, and resilience, qualities that no mansion, no wealth, nor social approval could provide."
Her father stared at him, taken aback by the directness and authority of his words. Elias did not flinch, did not waver. His calm confidence mirrored the lessons he had instilled in Clara, the embodiment of the principles she had begun to internalize.
Clara's father finally spoke, his tone a mixture of anger, disbelief, and an unwilling respect. You have changed," he said, his voice tight. "I did not expect—" "No, father," Clara interrupted gently yet firmly. "You did not understand. This place, these people, and the work I have done here have shown me a world you have never taught me to see. I have learned humility, endurance, observation, and wisdom. I have learned that life is not measured by wealth or status, but by the strength of one's character and the depth of one's understanding." Her father remained silent, the words settling over him like the oppressive Louisiana heat. Clara stood tall, her eyes unwavering, her presence commanding not through fear or arrogance, but through the quiet power of experience, resilience, and self-awareness. In the days that followed, Clara's resolve continued to strengthen. She moved through the quarters with increasing confidence, her labor executed with precision, her observations keen, and her interactions marked by an understanding of human nature that had grown far beyond her years. She had faced danger, social tension, and the judgment of her own father, emerging stronger and more self-assured. Her relationship with Elias also evolved. He recognized her growing independence, her capacity for judgment, and her understanding of the quarter's complexities. Their conversations deepened, no longer confined to instruction alone, but encompassing reflection, strategy, and insight. Clara found herself testing her own knowledge, making decisions with subtle guidance from Elias, and discovering the full extent of her capabilities. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence damaged by a sudden storm, Elias paused and looked at her, a rare softness in his expression. "You have learned much, Clara. Not just skill, but patience, judgment, and awareness. You are no longer merely following my guidance. You are thinking for yourself, anticipating consequences, and acting with understanding." Clara felt a swell of pride, tempered by humility. She knew that her journey was far from complete. There were always more lessons to learn, more challenges to face, and more dangers to navigate. Yet in that moment, she recognized the depth of her own growth and the power of the experiences she had endured. The confrontation with her father had crystallized a truth that Clara had been slowly discovering through months of labor and observation. True strength was not granted by birth, wealth, or social standing, but earned through experience, reflection, and courage. She had faced adversity, navigated danger, and asserted herself with clarity and confidence. She had earned respect, both from those who guided her and from those who had once doubted her. As summer gave way to the cooler days of early fall, Clara continued to cultivate her abilities, deepening her understanding of the quarters, her connection to Elias, and her own capacity for resilience. She observed the workers, learned from their knowledge, and contributed to the daily rhythm of life with skill and insight. Each day reinforced the lessons she had absorbed: humility, observation, foresight, and the quiet authority that came from competence and understanding. Clara's father returned to the mansion, his mind weighed by the confrontation, his pride tempered by the undeniable transformation of his daughter. He had seen, if only fleetingly, the strength, independence, and awareness that Clara had gained. Though he remained bound by the rigid expectations of Southern society, a measure of respect, reluctant perhaps but genuine, had taken root. Clara, however, no longer sought his approval. She had discovered a sense of self that transcended social expectation, a resilience that could not be shaken, and a growing bond with Elias that provided guidance, trust, and understanding. In the quarters, Clara Dubois continued to grow, each day a testament to her endurance, observation, and judgment. She had faced danger, social tension, and the scorn of her father, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable. The lessons of the quarters, taught through labor, observation, and Elias's steady guidance, had shaped her into someone who could navigate a world of complexity, danger, and subtle power with grace, intelligence, and quiet authority. By the end of this chapter of her life, Clara was no longer the girl deemed unmarriageable. She had become a young woman, discernment, courage, and understanding, capable of facing both the harsh realities of life and the intricate social dynamics of the quarters. Her journey of self-discovery, independence, and resilience was well underway, guided by experience, reflection, and the steady hand of Elias, who remained both teacher and trusted companion in a world that had demanded more of her than she had ever imagined. The days grew shorter as fall deepened over the Louisiana plantation, the air crisp with the promise of winter, and the fields tinged with gold and brown from the changing sugarcane. Clara Dubois moved through the quarters with a confidence she had never known in the halls of her father's mansion. She carried herself with quiet authority, her hands skilled, her body resilient, and her mind sharp with the lessons of labor, observation, and the subtle politics of human behavior. Yet, despite her growing competence, she felt the restless tug of ambition, a need to push herself beyond the boundaries she had cautiously explored. Elias noticed the change in her as well. He had always been her guide, steady and patient, teaching her the intricacies of the work and the delicate balance of authority and respect. But now Clara seemed ready to test the limits of her own skill and endurance. One morning, he found her at the edge of the field, surveying the farthest corner where the sugarcane met the swampy boundary. Her hands rested on the handle of a hoe, her posture straight, her expression focused. "You are restless," Elias said, stepping beside her. His voice was calm, even, yet carried the weight of observation. "I need to do more than follow instructions," Clara replied, her eyes scanning the distant fields. "I need to see what I am capable of without guidance. I need to test myself." Elias regarded her silently for a moment, then nodded. "Very well," he said, "but know this, testing limits is not merely physical. It requires foresight, judgment, and awareness. Every action carries consequences. You must be prepared to face them." Clara nodded, feeling a thrill of both excitement and apprehension. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of labor, the subtle lessons of observation, and the quiet authority she had begun to wield among the workers. But now she sought something more, an understanding of her own strength, both physical and mental, in the face of unforeseen challenges. The first test came sooner than she expected. As she worked to repair a section of fence that bordered the swamp, she heard the snapping of branches and the rustle of heavy movement through the cane. A wild boar, large and menacing, emerged from the thicket, its tusks glinting in the dappled sunlight. Clara froze for a moment, heart hammering, instincts screaming at her to flee. But she remembered Elias's lessons, awareness, composure, and measured action. The boar charged, and Clara reacted with a combination of quick thinking and physical skill she had honed over months of labor. She leapt to the side, using the fence post as a barrier, and managed to deflect the animal's momentum. Her muscles burned with exertion, her hands gripping the post, but she held firm. The boar, startled and frustrated, finally turned and disappeared back into the thicket, leaving Clara shaken but victorious. When Elias arrived moments later, he regarded her with a rare look of approval. "You acted well," he said, "not with panic but with calculation. That is how you face danger, not by fleeing, but by understanding it and responding wisely." The encounter left Clara exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. She had faced immediate danger alone and survived, relying on her judgment, strength, and the lessons Elias had instilled. It was her first major triumph, but it also reminded her of the ever-present risks of life in the quarters and the importance of vigilance, foresight, and composure. In the days that followed, Clara continued to push herself. She took on more complex tasks in the fields, tending to crops in the swampy edges that required careful navigation, knowledge of the land, and precise physical effort. She repaired tools, organized labor among the younger workers, and began to anticipate challenges before they arose. Her confidence grew, but so did her awareness of responsibility. Every decision she made could affect not only her own safety but the well-being of those around her. Elias guided her subtly, allowing her autonomy while providing insight when necessary. He taught her to read the signs of impending storms, to recognize weak points in the fences, and to anticipate the movement of livestock. Clara absorbed every detail, her mind and body working in concert to master the challenges of the quarters. She was learning not just to survive but to act as a leader, to assess risk, and to execute tasks with skill and foresight. Social dynamics, too, became a crucible for her growth. The young men who had once questioned her presence began to regard her with cautious respect, some even seeking her guidance in completing tasks. The older workers, who had been wary at first, now acknowledged her competence and the quiet authority she wielded. Clara learned to navigate the delicate hierarchy of the quarters, asserting herself when necessary, while maintaining humility and respect. She discovered that leadership was not about dominance or fear, but about skill, judgment, and the ability to inspire trust through consistent action. One afternoon, as she supervised a group repairing the irrigation channels, she faced a situation that tested both her judgment and courage. A sudden rainstorm threatened to flood the lower fields, and the young workers were unsure how to proceed. Clara quickly assessed the situation, directing them to reinforce the banks, divert water, and protect the crops. She acted decisively, her voice clear and authoritative, guiding the workers through the crisis. By the time the storm passed, the fields were intact, and the workers looked at her with admiration and relief. Elias observed from a distance, a faint smile on his face. "You acted well," he said when she approached, "not just with strength but with strategy. That is the mark of true capability. You are learning to command not by fear but by knowledge and presence." Clara felt a deep satisfaction, a sense of achievement that went beyond physical labor. She had begun to understand that mastery in the quarters was not merely about completing tasks, but about anticipating challenges, guiding others, and maintaining composure in the face of danger. It was a complex combination of skill, judgment, and emotional intelligence, qualities that had been forged through months of experience, observation, and guidance from Elias. Her bond with Elias continued to deepen. They spent long hours discussing strategy, the intricacies of labor, and the subtleties of human behavior. Clara began to reflect on her own growth, recognizing the changes in her character, her resilience, and her understanding of the world around her. She felt a growing sense of purpose and agency, a realization that she could navigate challenges, earn respect, and assert herself in a world that had once seemed beyond her comprehension. Yet, with triumph, came new challenges. Some of the older workers, wary of her growing influence, began to test her authority, challenging decisions or questioning her instructions. Clara faced these moments with a combination of firmness, observation, and patience. She learned to recognize the motivations behind dissent, to address concerns with clarity, and to maintain her composure even when provoked. Each confrontation was a lesson in diplomacy, judgment, and the subtle balance of respect and authority. One particularly tense encounter occurred when a young worker, emboldened by his own skill and the presence of others, openly questioned Clara's instructions during a repair task. The others watched, tension in the air. Clara took a deep breath, recalling Elias's lessons. She spoke calmly, explaining her reasoning, demonstrating the correct method, and guiding the group through the task. By the end, the young worker had complied, and the group executed the repair successfully. Clara realized that true authority was not imposed by intimidation, but earned through competence, clarity, and fairness. Her personal triumphs extended beyond physical labor and social navigation. Clara began to reflect on her identity, her ambitions, and the life she wanted to shape for herself. She recognized the stark contrast between the world of her father's mansion and the lessons she had learned in the quarters. Wealth, refinement, and social status had little meaning compared to resilience, judgment, and the ability to act with awareness and courage. Clara understood that she had grown stronger, wiser, and more capable than she had ever imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Clara continued to test her limits, facing new challenges in the fields, the cabins, and the swampy edges of the plantation. She confronted physical danger, navigated complex social dynamics, and exercised her growing authority with skill and insight. Each success reinforced her confidence, each challenge sharpened her judgment, and each moment of reflection deepened her understanding of herself and the world around her. Elias remained a constant presence, offering guidance when needed, but allowing Clara to act independently. He observed her triumphs with quiet pride, recognizing the transformation that months of labor, danger, and reflection had wrought. Their bond, rooted in shared experience, mutual respect, and trust, had grown into a partnership of insight and guidance. Clara had come to rely on his counsel, even as she developed the confidence to act on her own. By the end of this chapter, Clara had achieved a series of personal triumphs that marked a profound transformation. She had faced danger, navigated social tension, and exercised judgment and leadership in ways that her father could never have envisioned. She had learned to trust herself, to act with awareness, and to assert her authority through competence and presence. The lessons of the quarters had shaped her into a young woman capable of navigating complexity, danger, and responsibility with skill, courage, and insight. Clara Dubois, once deemed unmarriageable and fragile, had become a figure of strength, resilience, and discernment. She had tested her limits, faced the consequences of her actions, and emerged victorious through skill, judgment, and courage. Her journey of self-discovery and personal triumph was far from complete, but she had proven to herself, and to the quarters, that she possessed the qualities of endurance, awareness, and quiet authority that would guide her through the challenges yet to come. In the quiet evenings, after the day's labor was complete, Clara would sit with Elias, reflecting on the lessons learned and the challenges overcome. They spoke of strategy, observation, and the intricacies of human behavior, their conversations deepening the understanding and trust between them. Clara realized that her triumphs were not hers alone. They were forged through guidance, experience, and the subtle mentorship of a man who had taught her not just to survive, but to thrive. Through these trials and successes, Clara discovered a profound truth. True strength is born of experience, reflection, and courage. It is tempered by humility, sharpened by observation, and exercised through action. And as she looked across the fields, now dotted with workers she had learned to guide and respect, she understood that she had begun to forge her own place in the world, a place defined not by wealth or social expectation, but by resilience, competence, and insight. By the time the first chill of winter crept across the Dubois plantation, Clara Dubois had become almost unrecognizable to anyone who had seen her when she first arrived. The once delicate girl, dismissed by her father as fragile and unmarriageable, had been tempered and reshaped by months of labor, observation, and the subtle dangers of life in the quarters. Her hands were strong, her back lean and capable, her movements deliberate and precise. Yet it was her mind and spirit that had changed most profoundly. She had learned to anticipate consequences, to read the subtle cues of human behavior, and to navigate a world fraught with danger, jealousy, and social complexity with skill and composure. The lessons of the past months had brought her closer to Elias, whose steady guidance and quiet authority had been both shield and compass in this unfamiliar world. Their bond had grown beyond that of mentor and pupil into something more intricate: trust, respect, and a shared understanding of the subtle dynamics of life on the plantation. Clara had begun to internalize his principles: patience, observation, foresight, and the ability to act decisively when the moment demanded it. She was no longer merely following instruction, she was anticipating challenges, making judgments, and asserting authority where necessary. One morning, as frost clung to the edges of the fields and the first wisps of smoke rose from the workers' cabins, Clara faced a test unlike any before. A severe winter storm was approaching, threatening both the livestock and the crops. The younger workers were inexperienced with such weather, anxious and uncertain about how to protect their fields. Clara took stock of the situation, recalling everything Elias had taught her about anticipation, strategy, and leadership. She quickly organized teams, assigning tasks based on skill and stamina, instructing them on reinforcing fences, securing livestock, and safeguarding the harvest. Her voice was firm, calm, and commanding, yet it carried a subtle authority that inspired trust. The workers followed her guidance, responding to her observation and decisiveness with cooperation. Clara moved among them, adjusting strategies on the fly, anticipating failures, and reinforcing weak points. The storm descended with ferocity, winds lashing through the fields, rain flooding low-lying areas, but under Clara's careful direction, the plantation endured. She felt exhaustion burn through her muscles, yet a surge of pride swelled within her. This was not merely labor, it was leadership, judgment, and courage in action. Elias observed quietly from the edge of the field, noting her decisions, her calm in the face of chaos, and her ability to command respect through competence rather than fear. When the storm finally passed, he approached her, his expression unreadable but marked by faint approval. "You handled that well," he said, his voice calm. "Not everyone can manage labor, danger, and authority simultaneously. You did. That is the mark of someone who has learned more than skill. You have learned discernment, foresight, and composure." Clara nodded, her body trembling from exertion, her hands raw from work, but her mind sharp with awareness. She had faced real danger, orchestrated the survival of the plantation's livestock and fields, and earned the trust of those who had once doubted her. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of responsibility, the courage it took to act decisively, and the depth of insight that came from observing, learning, and reflecting. The events of that day rippled through the quarters. Workers who had been skeptical of her authority now looked to her with admiration and respect. Even those who had once challenged her instructions now deferred, recognizing the skill, judgment, and composure that had allowed her to navigate the storm successfully. Clara realized that her growth was not merely physical or intellectual, but deeply social and moral. She had learned to command respect, to earn trust, and to act with authority rooted in competence and fairness, yet along. Side triumph came tension. Clara's father, ever obsessed with social standing and appearances, had heard rumors of her transformation. Determined to reassert control, he arrived at the plantation unexpectedly one afternoon, riding with the arrogance and expectation of authority that had characterized his previous visits. He found Clara overseeing a group repairing a collapsed section of irrigation channels, her hands calloused, her body streaked with mud and sweat, her voice steady and commanding. "Clara," he called, dismounting in a flurry of indignation. "What are you doing here? I have heard troubling reports of your behavior. This is no place for a lady. You should be in the mansion, under my care, not—" Clara stood tall, her eyes unwavering, her presence a testament to the strength and composure she had cultivated. She did not flinch, nor did she retreat. "Father," she said calmly, cutting him off, "I am doing what I must to ensure the survival of the plantation and the safety of those who work here. I am learning responsibility, leadership, and judgment. I am no longer a child who must hide behind wealth or status. I am capable of understanding and acting in a world far larger than your mansion walls." Her father's face reddened with anger, his pride wounded by the clear authority and poise she displayed. He sputtered, struggling for control, but Clara did not yield. Her time in the quarters had forged her into someone who could stand firm, who could command respect through action and discernment rather than inherited position. Elias, standing nearby, offered silent support, a subtle presence that reinforced her authority without intrusion. "You have changed," he admitted finally, his voice tight with conflicted emotion. "I do not recognize the girl I once sought to guide." "I am not the same," Clara replied, her tone steady but imbued with conviction. "And I do not wish to be. I have learned the value of work, observation, and judgment. I have learned what it means to be accountable, resilient, and capable. I respect you as my father, but I will no longer allow fear or expectation to dictate my actions." Her father, taken aback by the resolute clarity in her voice, faltered. He could not deny the evidence of her transformation, her command of the workers, the respect she inspired, and the tangible results of her labor. And yet, the rigidity of his pride and the constraints of society made it difficult for him to reconcile with the daughter before him. Clara's victory was not merely personal, it was a challenge to the hierarchy and expectations he had always sought to impose. The weeks that followed cemented Clara's position in the quarters. She continued to lead, observe, and act decisively, guiding labor, protecting the workers from both environmental and social dangers, and navigating rivalries with skill and tact. She tested herself continually, facing physical challenges, social tension, and moral dilemmas, and each success reinforced her confidence and self-awareness. The bond with Elias deepened, becoming a partnership of insight, mentorship, and mutual respect. One particularly defining moment came when a fire broke out in one of the storage barns. The flames spread quickly, fueled by dry hay and strong winds. Panic surged among the workers, many of whom lacked experience with such emergencies. Clara sprang into action, directing water buckets, organizing efforts to remove flammable materials, and instructing others on safe evacuation routes for both people and livestock. Her voice cut through the chaos, calm yet commanding, guiding the group with decisiveness that only months of experience could produce. By the time the fire was extinguished, no lives had been lost, and damage was contained. The workers looked at Clara with awe, acknowledging her courage, judgment, and ability to lead under extreme pressure. Elias approached her afterward, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "You have faced fire, Lita, ally and figuratively, and prevailed. This is no longer a matter of instruction. You have mastered the principles we have cultivated together. You are ready to act independently, with wisdom and courage." Clara felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a recognition of her journey from fragile daughter to capable leader. She had survived danger, earned respect, and proven her judgment. She had confronted her father, faced natural disasters, navigated social dynamics, and tested her limits. Each challenge had shaped her into a young woman of resilience, awareness, and authority. Evenings in the quarters became a time for reflection. Clara and Elias would sit together after the day's labor, discussing the lessons learned, analyzing mistakes and triumphs, and considering strategies for future challenges. Their conversations were no longer merely instructional, they were reflective, philosophical, and deeply intertwined with Clara's evolving understanding of life, responsibility, and human nature. She had come to value Elias not just as a teacher, but as a partner in insight. Someone whose guidance had enabled her growth, but who now treated her as an equal in understanding. By the end of the winter, Clara's transformation was complete. She had evolved from a fragile, uncertain girl into a young woman of competence, authority, and self-awareness. She could navigate danger, inspire respect, and exercise judgment with clarity and courage. The quarters, once a world she had feared, had become a place of mastery, insight, and connection. Her father, though still bound by societal expectations, could no longer dismiss or underestimate her. Clara Dubois had learned the true meaning of resilience, observation, and authority. She had faced the storms of labor, the unpredictability of nature, the intricacies of social dynamics, and the weight of parental expectation. And through it all, she had emerged not only unbroken, but empowered, capable of shaping her own path with courage, wisdom, and quiet strength. As she stood at the edge of the fields one evening, watching the sun sink below the horizon and the workers return to their cabins, Clara felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She had discovered her strength, her judgment, and her capacity for leadership. She had learned the value of observation, patience, and action. And she had realized, most importantly, that her worth was not defined by social expectation, birth, or wealth, but by her own courage, resilience, and insight. In the cold, fading light of that winter evening, Clara understood that she had become something her father, her society, and even she herself had never imagined, a young woman of power, presence, and wisdom, capable of navigating the world with intelligence, courage, and grace. And by her side, Elias remained, a constant reminder of the guidance, trust, and partnership that had shaped her into the person she had become. Clara's journey forged in sweat, labor, observation, and resilience, had reached a culmination. She was no longer merely the unmarriageable daughter of a wealthy Louisiana planter. She was a force of judgment, skill, and strength, someone who had faced danger, asserted authority, and emerged victorious in a world that demanded every ounce of courage and intelligence she could muster. And in that victory, she discovered not just her own capacity, but the profound satisfaction of knowing she had shaped her destiny with her own hands, mind, and heart.